left-handed and so forth. They've learned a lot in recent years, and Karsten Thede, using the Magdalen Greek papyrus from Oxford College, was able to date it essentially contemporaneous with Matthew, and it corresponds with Textus Receptus for those that are interested in that sort of thing. But we're not going to go down that path. The key fact here, of course, is that it was dated much earlier than some of the skeptics have said in the past. But we're also going to hear a great deal about the Gnostic Gospels. Not even the most radical scholar seriously believes that the Gospel of Thomas, for example, was written by the Thomas of the New Testament, or that the Gospel of Philip was written by the Philip of the New Testament, and so forth. These are apocrypha, all under false pseudonyms. They were attributed to the apostles to give their speculations legitimacy. They're not Gospels, by the way. They don't have any historically verifiable facts. They're just opinions, speculative opinions. The early church rejected any documents that were written under pseudonyms because they felt it was inconsistent with the concept of divine inspiration of the New Testament. And all these Gospels, Gnostic Gospels, were written centuries after the Gospel period, typically in the 3rd and 4th century. And they contrast with the eyewitness accounts that we find in the New Testament. And they make no real pretense of being an actual record of events. They're really just speculations of various kinds. And they're anti-historical rather than simply non-historical. But these so-called Gnostic Gospels, the Gnostics, of course, believed that salvation came through hidden knowledge that they had. And there's a whole collection of these that were found in Nag Hammadi, a village in Egypt. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Truth, and about 4 dozen others of these. Sort of reminds you of Matthew 13, where we find Jesus describing these birds that pick up the seed of those that were not grounded properly. When anyone heareth the word of the kingdom and understandeth it not, then cometh the wicked one, as typified by the birds in the parable, and catcheth away that which was sown in his heart. The parables of Matthew 13 highlight the very thing we're witnessing here. Paul warns Timothy, his protege. He says, "For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lust shall heap to themselves teachers having itching ears. And they shall turn away their ears from the truth and be turned unto fables." And that's exactly what we're watching happen in our culture. So why are these things accepted? Certainly not due to any serious historical research. There's not one single verifiable fact in any of these. A fable, simply, that some have chosen to embrace. Napoleon was famous for saying, "What is history but a fable agreed upon?" And a pretty cynical outlook. The spirit of our times. Doctrinal diversity is the order of the day. Pressure of feminism. The quest for a do-it-yourself religion. A religion that's popular rather than necessarily true. So what we're going to do as we approach this topic, I'm going to call, for lack of a better term, Epistemology 101. We're going to get right at the basics of this. Epistemology is simply the study of knowledge in terms of its scope and its limits. And how do we know anything? How do we learn anything? Let's talk about that for a bit. When we were very, very small and in a playpen, our world consisted of that playpen. That was our boundaries that we could deal with. In that environment, we got a little familiarity with acoustics, visual colors, touch and textures, three-dimensional perception began to take place, basic motor skills to be able to reach and pick up and so forth. Then as we matured, our world broadened to our playroom. Our universe expanded within the confines of our playroom. So we began to have more discernment of things. We began to get introduced to rules and an order to our routine. We faced increased challenges of things that we could deal with, but also increased hazards. Hopefully, with adequate supervision, nothing serious occurred. So as we matured, our next boundary was expanded to our homes. And there we had increased mobility and challenges. We had, again, hazards and even potential disasters if we failed to be responsive. And more and more, subjection to guidance was essential as we had the mobility of our home. Pretty soon, as we grow further, we got to school, and our universe began to expand. We had even more increased mobility and challenges, increased hazards. Subjection to guidance was even more essential until we finally were members of the community. And we had to learn how to handle unanticipated events. And we more frequently encountered things that were less predictable. And we had to start qualifying our sources of guidance, not just our parents, but others in whom we could place or shouldn't place confidence. And of course, as we matured as adults, our university expanded to the world itself. And again, more and more, it was incumbent upon us to qualify sources of information about the world that we live in. And ultimately, of course, we're now facing the cosmos itself, the universe, in some much broader sense. And so, now as we went from the playpen, our epistemology was very heavily influenced by trial and error as we tried things and tried to learn from them. And we began to get some internal processing of what we were learning and, of course, getting some external guidance. As our boundaries expanded, our trial and error became less a percentage. More and more we had guidance. And as our boundaries continued to expand, the trial and error mode of our gathering information decreased, and our internal processing and external guidance becomes more and more paramount until we get further and further to where finally facing the cosmos where the trial and error factor is pretty de minimis. It's pretty hard to conduct experiments on the universe itself. And yet more and more are we dependent upon qualifying sources of information for guidance. And so that's a perspective from which there are some issues that we're facing. Cosmic issues. Is the universe infinite or finite? The great discovery of 20th century science was the discovery and the realization that the universe is not infinite, it's finite. How long has it been there? All kinds of guesses. A very elusive science at best. More to the point, was it designed or simply the result of some kind of cosmic accident? It's really quite astonishing to see learned people come to very, very bizarre conclusions. Are there limits to size? How large is the universe? How small are the smallest elements? That may be surprising, what we've discovered about that. We speak of empty space. Is space really empty? Has time always been the same? Are there other dimensions beyond the four that we experience directly, the three spatial dimensions and time? Those are issues. So we're going to explore the boundaries of our reality, and that's going to be our primary epistemological challenge in this session. And we're constantly subject to illusions of various kinds. And these illusions can be colorful minor things, or they can be very profound issues that we're facing. So first thing we're going to try to do is develop a critical perspective. There are two concepts very frequently discussed in mathematics that we cannot find in our physical universe, surprisingly enough. One is infinity. We talk about it, we put it in equations, we can deal with it conceptually. Can we find anything in our universe that's really infinite? And the other concept that's just as elusive is a concept called randomness. Randomness. There are mathematical tests for a series of numbers to see if they're random or not. It turns out that if you're faced with designing a computer and you need a source of random numbers, that turns out to be a major challenge because we discover there is no such thing as randomness. There are things that come close to randomness. In the computer field, you have what's called pseudo-random number generators because a true random number turns out to be surprisingly absent from our physical universe. That leads to a whole field of mathematics called the theory of chaos. We're also going to talk a little bit about the existence of hyperspaces. Fancy word for simply spaces that have more than 3 dimensions. We're going to talk about this to broaden our own personal horizons a bit here. So these two imputed concepts. The first is randomness. The professional term for this is entropy. You'll hear thermodynamics people others speak of entropy. Entropy is simply randomness in an absolute sense. And most engineers and scientists are trained in deterministic process. 2 + 2 = 4 always. 2 + 3 = 5 always, precisely. Those are deterministic concepts. In our real world, we encounter a field of processes that we call stochastic processes, where one or more of